The year is 1944. The city of Paris is under curfew. The Royal Air Force of Britain is bombing France's railways and other logistical targets in an attempt to disrupt the Nazi occupation's control over the country. Meanwhile, the German occupiers have had to increase their reprisals against an emboldened French resistance. After the occupiers expanded the mandatory labor conscription in 1943, support for the resistance has become more widespread. But the open opposition shown by the resistance is not by any means characteristic of the whole of the French people, most of whom think that open rebellion is hopeless. They believe the only thing they can really do is endure the occupation until the time is right. Nevertheless, the defeatist attitudes of the first years of the 1940s are a thing of the past. After the Battle of Stalingrad, more and more among the French have begun to feel that the defeat of Germany is inevitable. The lingering fear that now seems to characterize the mood of 1944 in France fixates on this question: what will be the cost of liberation? The Russians had paid a great, great cost in blood. What would the butcher's bill in France amount to when all was said and done? How could anyone be certain? For most of the French people, their time is occupied by waiting, a kind of maddening calm before a coming storm, a storm whose intensity might easily consume them. In this occupied Paris, Georges Bataille was among those who found the waiting maddening. He was part of a clique of intellectuals, artists, and writers who would gather in private venues, someone's home or someone's apartment, for group discussions, parties, and sometimes more raucous forms of entertainment. It was at one of these group discussions that Bataille presented his lecture, A Discussion on Sin. We discussed the major ideas of that work in the previous episode. It was a transgressive presentation, especially given that some Christians were in attendance, including some priests, Father Danielou and Father Moore. Many other famous thinkers could be found in attendance at these discussions: Jean-Paul Sartre and Jean Hippolyte, Pierre Klosowski, Albert Camus, Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir. But this clique also found less intellectual ways of occupying themselves. They called these gatherings fiestas. At the first fiesta, the painter Pablo Picasso put on a performance of a play he'd written at the home of Michel Léry, a surrealist writer. The players of this performance were Sartre, Camus, and de Beauvoir. Bataille was one of the spectators, as was Jacques Lacan. In March, Bataille hosted a fiesta at his own apartment in Paris. Heyman, in his biography of Sartre, writes, quote, Queneau and Bataille dueled with bottles. Camus and Le Marchand played tunes on saucepan lids. Sartre conducted an imaginary orchestra from the bottom of a cupboard. End quote. And there were many more fiestas after. They would last all night because of the curfew. Once it was sundown, you had to stay at whoever's house until dawn. They always involved drinking and absurd behavior and most of all dancing. Toulouse danced the Paso Doble with Camus, and Bataille, in his 1944 diaries from February to April, writes of a night he spent dancing with Sartre, quote, happiness, remembering the night of drinking and dancing by myself like a peasant, a faun with couples all around me. Alone? Actually, there we were, dancing face to face in a potlatch of absurdity, the philosopher, Sartre, and me. I remember whirling about, dancing, jumping, stomping down on the wooden floor, acting rebellious and crazy like a fool. For me, there's a connection between this dance, with Sartre opposite me, and a painting I recall, Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon. The third character was a store window dummy made out of a horse's skull and a flowing striped yellow and mauve dressing gown, a grimly medieval canopied bed presiding over the fun. 5 months of nightmare ended in a carnival. What a surprise, fraternizing like that with Sartre and Camus. I'm talking like a schoolboy. End quote. The potlatch, if we'll remember, has a specific meaning for Bataille. We received the word from the gift-giving ceremonies of indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest. For Bataille, it is an example of unproductive expenditure, the willingness to spend without expectation of return. A potlatch of absurdity, therefore, is a term he uses to describe drunkenly dancing with Sartre, stomping about, acting ridiculous, because it's a kind of meaningless activity, a meaningless expenditure of energy, something done only for itself and for no other purpose. A carnival that punctuates the nightmares of the war. The painting by Picasso that he references is worth taking a look at yourself. It's a depiction of 5 women, but in a kind of jagged, surreal presentation. Perhaps Bataille is thinking about the way that their bodies moved, or at least appeared to move, while dancing in a drunken haze. What I love about this scene in Bataille's diary is that it captures the absurd and almost obscene contradictions that must have been felt during a very particular moment in history, dancing and having fun while the world burns, partying and living like socialites under a fascist occupation, dueling with wine bottles while soldiers open fire on one another, debating philosophy and giving seminars on Nietzsche while Europe is in the grip of a kind of mass psychosis. Bataille's journal entries from February to April 1944 often concern the issues that he raised in Summit and Decline, or as he titled his lecture to the group of intellectuals, A Discussion on Sin, which is contained in that section. Bataille applies them to his own experiences, these ideas. He wrestles with these insights, with how he's going to live them out. Bataille also withheld the actual dates of these writings, simply grouping them together according to clusters of months, so that the reader is not meant to know exactly when a given thought was written down or when a given anecdote took place, just the general stretch of time in which it happened. As with the rest of the material in his book on Nietzsche, summarizing these diaries is an impossible task. There are certain through lines, certain threads that we can grab onto that will be, I think, of interest to readers of both Nietzsche and Bataille, but you have to, in order to get the whole picture, you have to read these diaries yourself. But what seems to have been particularly on his mind in the diaries from February to April are some remarks made by Sartre in response to Bataille's lecture. Sylvain L'Étranger writes in his introduction to Bataille's On Nietzsche, quote, "Everyone, including Sartre, noticed the gloomy outlook of Bataille's much-touted, self-touted laughter. Nietzsche's laughter, Sartre wrote, is lighter. Bataille's is, quote, bitter and strained. He tells us that he laughs. He doesn't make us laugh." A small point, apparently, but one that cut deep. Actually, Bataille was rather piqued. "I talked about laughter," he said during the discussion, "and I was depicted by Sartre as having a hollow laughter. This kind of laughter is most foreign to my own." Everyone in the audience praised the authenticity of Bataille's voice, an unusual feature in philosophers. But no one heard his laughter. "You can never hear laughter in the Bible," Bataille remarked curtly. End quote. And that's a fair point. Famously, Jesus himself never laughs in the New Testament. Perhaps the reference to the Bible played better with the Christians in the room, however, than to the likes of Sartre himself. Elsewhere in the introduction, L'Étranger relates one of the exchanges from during the group discussion that followed Bataille's lecture. Quote, "Why sin?" Hippolyte asked, noting a Christian ambiguity in Bataille's speech. "When you talk about sin," Sartre charged, "I have the feeling that you mean something entirely different." Bataille recognized flatly that he used the notion of sin simply because it refers to a condition experienced with a great intensity. "That changes everything," Sartre exclaimed. End quote. In spite of this exclamation from Sartre, which seems to offer Bataille some charity in interpretation, Bataille found himself compelled to further distinguish his project from a recapitulation to Christian ideas. In one of the journal entries, he says it is, quote, "a whimsical idea that I am suggesting hyper-Christianity," end quote. Now, this isn't to say that Bataille neatly distinguishes his project from Christianity, even the label of hyper-Christianity. In fact, in context, the statement is a bit ambiguous, whether Bataille is sort of deriding the idea that he's suggesting this or taking pleasure in this whimsical idea. But if we take a step back here, I think we can recognize that No ordinary Christian, no traditional Christian would be comfortable with Bataille's interpretations of their religion. If he is extracting something essential from Christianity and bringing it into his own philosophical perspective, perhaps communion as a consequence of crime, the excesses and evil of the summit as essential for all moralities, he nevertheless does so in such a way that the ordinary moral understanding of existence that comes to us through Christianity can't really survive in Bataille's philosophy. That much is clear. I mean, at times he's celebrating evil. Yes, sin is a central concept in his lecture, but sin is the very thing that bridges the gap between man and God, whereas Christianity traditionally teaches that it's what divides us off from God, from the communion with God. Whereas for Bataille, it's really both in a sort of paradoxical relationship. We have to be lacerated in order to experience the divine. We actually, in fact, have to lacerate the divine body in order to come into communion with it. So it's crime and communion joined together. It's the heights of evil as the height of religious experience. We also have to consider Sartre's critique of Bataille's laughter. Throughout, Bataille continuously returns to the theme of laughter. And if we'll remember, he ended Summit and Decline on the note that in absentia of answers, in absence of certain knowledge or of the possibility of unriddling the paradox of the summit, all one can really do is laugh. And in the group discussion that followed, there was some back and forth about what we might call types of laughter, I suppose. Whether one's laughter can be likened to Zarathustra's laughter, how Zarathustra's laughter might differ from the laughter of Turin, the laughter of Nietzsche's descent into madness. Here in the Diaries, Bataille returns to this theme of there being many kinds of laughter, writing, quote, "I really hate complacent laughter, the cliquish humor of the so-called whiny. Nothing is less characteristic of me than bitter laughter. I laugh innocently and divinely. I don't laugh when I'm depressed, and when I do laugh, I'm having fun." End quote. Even if we are to celebrate laughter, this doesn't mean you should just laugh for no reason. You just laugh frivolously. There's no reason to celebrate complacent laughter or bitter laughter. There's all kinds of fake social laughter that really just amounts to a pose. What we're really talking about here, what Bataille, the kind of laughter that he's trying to valorize, springs from a kind of inner experience. The laughter is spontaneous, it's automatic. And so, in other words, in response to Sartre, just because Bataille is speaking of laughter in his lecture does not mean that the lecture is an occasion to laugh. Bataille includes an anecdote that he and some friends were laughing about the crimes of Dr. Petiot. He was a famous serial killer of the time who would tell his patients that they were calcium deficient, book them an appointment for treatment at Rue Le Sueur, and then inject them with poison. He would watch from a periscope in the adjoining room as the patients died horrific deaths. He would then dissolve their bodies and steal everything they had. But Bataille says he is, quote, embarrassed at having laughed with friends at the crimes of Dr. Petiot. The laughter that, in all likelihood, has the summit as its object arises from our not being conscious of it. Like the friends I mentioned, I'm moved from nameless horror to mindless laughter, end quote. Why would such laughter be a source of embarrassment? I mean, it's certainly a familiar experience, I think, for many of us, to be moved from horror to laughter. Sometimes laughter is a simple release of tension, that once the tension builds up to a level that you can no longer bear it. Sometimes spontaneous and unrestrained laughter springs out of us as we contemplate the worst aspects of existence: torture, murder, blasphemous, atrocious things, so on and so forth. The laughter that we express in these cases conveys a sense of wonder at the limits of human depravity. That's the way Bataille seems to understand it. And this does not make laughter springing from horror any less honest than any other kind of laughter, but, quote, attempts to continue with this and pry open the beyond would make laughter something intended and so ring false from lack of simplicity, End quote. So one shouldn't force it or intentionally expose themselves to horror for the sake of provoking laughter, because the intentionality would ruin that type of laughter. It would no longer be spontaneous. And we can see this, I think, with, a lot of horror comedy, or the genres that they've called torture porn, these things in cinema where, movies such as Hostel or Saw can actually be quite funny from a certain perspective, but there is something rather morbid and excessive about it. And if somebody tells you that their favorite movies are the Saw films, it kind of raises an eyebrow, right? And there's something about it that is a bit forced and a bit, well, as the kids say, edgy. You're just being edgy here in the sense of, again, a pose, somebody being edgy, somebody acting edgy. Now, what is the significance of this type of laughter, then? Bataille's explanation harkens back to one of the core ideas of Nietzsche, the innocence of becoming, the absolute guiltless character of existence, when we view existence from a non-moral lens. And so Bataille writes, quote, "Laughter blesses where God curses. Unlike God, humanity isn't condemned to condemn," end quote. But then why would he be embarrassed? And I can only conclude in my reading that this is one of those aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy that Bataille is struggling to live with. His laughter blesses the world, a totally guiltless world. But, that means that even the work of this serial killer is innocent. Now, isn't that a somewhat embarrassing outcome of the innocence of becoming? And more than that, he asks, quote, "What if I said that the periscope used on Rue Le Sueur is the summit? Horror and disgust would make me feel like throwing up. Can nearness to the summit be discerned in wrenching horror and disgust?" End quote. Good question. Bataille's description of the summit as the supreme act of evil, the violation of limits, the needless sacrifice of life, not for any productive ends, in the way that we, might try to justify killing, for example, during warfare, but killing for the sake of the crime, a desire that justifies itself and needs no outside justification. Uncomfortably, the amorality, the dance between good and evil that Bataille has suggested, has made the periscope, the voyeuristic enjoyment of suffering and death, into something we are unable to morally confront, but can only really laugh at out of a sense of wonderment and horror. And he goes on in this passage, in one of the most interesting parts of the Diaries, to compare the periscope, this voyeurism of suffering, to the crucifixion itself. Quote, "With both, sinners get off on the results of crimes they have committed." End quote. And obviously there's a double meaning there that comes through beautifully in English. Getting off without punishment for a crime, or getting off sexually. And here, to perhaps use an all-too-modern example, I'm reminded of some of the criticism that was levied at Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ as a form of torture porn for Christians. I mean, the whole genre of secular torture porn, the films we just mentioned, that in and of itself is somewhat interesting because there's a kind of pornographic enjoyment that we get from watching extreme violence. But in Passion of the Christ, we see how the story of the crucifixion provides a perverse kind of enjoyment specifically for the Christian, who believes himself to be a sinner and Christ to be his redeemer. And he's getting pleasure from watching Christ's suffering in a way. He's also Christ's victimizer. Christ is the victim of his sin. So what does the Christian enjoy about this? What could they enjoy about this? Well, perhaps the Christian would say the enjoyment is not in the violence itself, but in the wonderment that he feels at Christ's endurance of the suffering, and the guilt that he feels at having had a hand in this greatest of crimes, like the wonderment that the sinner feels at his own guilt and the magnitude of it. But that makes Christ's forgiveness of him, the sinner, it makes it all the more moving. It inspires a sense of wonderment in how moving it is. It's a kind of pornographic provocation to repentance. And Bataille says, in repentance, the Christian believes that he's taking action. Remember how action is a very central action and goals. It's a very central aspect of the discussion last time about fragmentation. But the immense and frankly unbearable guilt reaches a limit and breaks forth into a sense of potency. We can interpret this as the decline that follows the summit of the crucifixion, which is an emotional summit, a summit of laceration, a laceration literally again of the flesh of the divine man, but also the inner laceration that the Christian feels of his own guilt and his culpability. And I would recommend to go back and listen to the first episode if you haven't heard it, primarily about the lecture Summit and Decline, if you want a more thorough examination of these themes. But so this is the sacrilegious interpretation of Christ's passion. It's being likened to the voyeurism of a serial killer, enjoying the deaths of his victims. Similarly, Christ is the innocent victim of mankind's sins, and Christians, don't they just love portraying his suffering, making depictions of it, putting depictions of it all over their churches, fixating on that imagery? So it's voyeuristic. And I mean, this is why it would be difficult to describe Bataille's observations here as anything that could have come from the hand of a Christian, or for that matter, even a hyper-Christian. It's clear that he wishes to use the concepts of guilt, sin, and sacrifice in a new way, drawing upon the Christian tradition for support, but in no way returning to its values. And so I think we can justifiably imagine that Bataille is perhaps responding to Sartre, who perceived a kind of bitterness or anguish in Bataille when Bataille writes these following words, quote, "I love irreligiousness, the disrespect involved in risk-taking and gambling. In risk-taking, I sometimes push my luck so far that I lose even anguish as a possibility. Anguish, in this case, would be withdrawal from risk. Love is my necessity. I'm impelled to drift into happiness, sensing chance there. First, rapturously to win, then laceratingly to let go of the winnings, in a game that exhausts me. To encourage bitterness in those last words, words of renewed anguish, would be to avoid taking risks. I can't take risks without this anguish of feeling suspended, but to take risks means to overcome anguish. I'm afraid that this apology will only encourage foolishness and banal rhetoric. Love is simple, uncomplicated." End quote. So much of a denial of his anguish here. And in this passage, he emphasizes irreligiosity, disrespect, and above all, the focus is on his love of chance, his love of risk, his love of uncertainty, and how in this mindset, that of the gambler, the risk-taker, anguish is overcome. The gambler may experience a form of anguish if he wagers everything and loses, but if you are such a person, such a committed gambler, so in love with gambling that you can't live any other way, you would be in more anguish if you declined to take the risk. The boredom and the joylessness of that existence would truly be anguish. There is a later passage where he elaborates on this, quote, "Risk is a kind of renunciation. The sum risked by real gamblers is lost as a type of resource, not to be gambled again. If you lose this sum, there's nothing more to say. But in winning, if gain is added, further stakes to be gambled are created, and that remains the sole possibility. Money burns a hole in my pocket when I gamble. Excited by the betting, I dedicate myself to gambling. To play from formula or mathematical speculations is the opposite of gambling as a calculus of chance probabilities." End quote. And so what he's referring to at the end there, the professional poker player who plays his hands from a statistical strategy based on iterated games of poker, he's not a real gambler, at least not in the sense that Bataille wishes to invoke the term. It's too much of a game of skill, right? In the same way that the matador in the bullfight is not really risking his life, right? And perhaps what Bataille wants is something where you can really risk yourself. And so the gambler's devotion, his renunciation, so we're putting it in an almost ascetic commitment, not to gamble for accumulation, but to gamble with the eye to create new opportunities, to take bigger risks. Bataille rebukes those who might call his approach to life bitter. Don't sense any bitterness in my words, that the game exhausts me. When I say it exhausts me, the game exhausting me is where my happiness lies. My happiness is in needlessly spending myself. And so anguish becomes impossible so long as I can keep taking these risks. It's not that I need to win in order to gain, in order to acquire. Because when I win, the money just burns a hole in my pocket. I just want to spend more. It's the opposite of that. And so Bataille says, love is my necessity. How does this all connect to it? Well, he's connecting amor fati, the love of fate, to the will to chance. The love of fate is by necessity the love of chance, because fate is uncertain. One does not know what fortune has in store for them. So to love chance is to love fate. But love has become such a fraught term to invoke in philosophy because it refers to all these forms of love which are abstracted from love in the ordinary sense, in the carnal sense. And so in some of these passages, Bataille takes a stance against what might be called the conventional Christian conception that the highest type of love is the love of God, the kind of unselfish love that isn't driven by fickle passion or by physiologically caused infatuations. There is always this notion of a kind of pure love in Christianity, in which one loves one's neighbor and indeed the whole of humanity equally. A kind of non-discriminating love, a love that doesn't recognize what we might call, an order of rank, to use Nietzsche's language. All physiological love that springs from the body, from the passions, is actually rather inegalitarian. It is rank-ordered. We hold our beloved, our lover, above other human beings in value. And when it comes to the family, you're going to hold your children's lives above the lives of other people's children. It's not as if Christians have somehow overcome these choosy forms of love. They've rather invented this notion of a kind of pure spiritual love that they can then hold to be higher. Bataille inverts this by holding the selfish feeling of love, the love for one's beloved, for their lover, carnal love, right? He holds this above the love of God. One is an expression of honest desire, the other is a kind of abstraction that, at least it seems, has been conceptualized in order to give ourselves a sense of absolute certainty, of a sense of security as regards the fate of the soul. So we've just been connecting love, right, amor fati, to this will to chance. And so we have this idea of the love of God, on the other hand, that should one love God, there's no longer any chance involved, any risk involved. You're ultimately, the only thing that really matters is the fate of your eternal soul, whatever travails might befall you in this world, and ultimately you can have assurances that your soul will be taken care of in the hereafter. And so Bataille's attitude is in some sense diametrically opposed to the Christian attitude on love, and I'm going to quote from the Diaries here in abridged form. Quote, "I hate lies, poetic nonsense, but the desire within us has never lied. It's true, the beloved individual differs from the conception I have of that individual. What's worse, to identify the real with the object of desire, it seems, presupposes extraordinary luck. Compared to the person I love, the universe seems poor and empty. The universe isn't, quote, risked, since it's not, quote, perishable. But the beloved is the, quote, beloved for only a single person. Carnal love, because not, quote, sheltered from thieves or vicissitudes, is greater than divine love. It risks me and the one I love. God, by definition, isn't risked. However far the lovers of God go with their passion, they conceive of it as outside the play of risk, as beyond grace and the happiness of the elect." End quote. So the beloved is risked, whereas God isn't. So first of all, a large part of Bataille's musings on chance involve this idea of lover's luck. We discussed this a bit at the end of the last episode, but there's this whole play of chance involved in two lovers meeting. You have this double coincidence of attraction that has to occur between two people, and the factors that make you attractive are not always within your control, or rather not strictly within your control. Certainly you're not in control of the things that a given person will find attractive, because there's always matter of interpretation or preference. But even just your physical appearance, we call it the genetic lottery, don't we? So attractiveness and success in matters of love, these are just as uncertain in this world as the prospects for securing material success or fame. Again, there's some element of your own willpower involved in your own discipline, but nevertheless, we might say chance has the greater share it has the lion's share of control over how all of these things are going to play out. Because you can make yourself very attractive, and you can become financially successful, and you can become charming and educated, and nevertheless, the person that you're infatuated with, that you find very attractive, for whatever reason, may just not be interested in you, right? And that's not anyone's fault. That's just chance. Now, all of these things, right, Christians tend to refer to these things as vainglorious. These are self-absorbed desires that don't really matter. The world's going to end one day anyway. You'll get your perfect body in heaven. And in heaven, you'll be freed from lust, for that matter. So many of these pursuits are sort of denigrated by the Christian. But for Bataille, again, holding carnal love even higher than divine love, he sees this element of the affirmation of chance involved. That's, in some sense, exemplified by the chance involved in pursuing love, pursuing physical love. And beyond that, when you pour yourself into a lover, you risk losing that lover. Because, among other things, we live in a world of mortality and impermanence. In fact, we could say it's certain that you will lose them someday, or that they'll lose you. You just don't know when. You never know where or how. We also have to think about having a beloved at this time during World War II. Suppose a stray artillery shell hits your lover's house or apartment. Suppose they're killed in a bombing as collateral damage. Later in the text, as we'll see, the day-to-day uncertainty of what could happen to his lover, a woman referred to in the text only by the letter K, causes Bataille a good deal of stress. And yet he affirms this uncertainty. He affirms the risk that one takes when one sinks their love into another human being. And this risk just isn't there when you sink your love into God. So in a really important sense, his love of chance is purely irreligious. It's purely non-Christian. His obsession with lust, with carnal love, speaks to this. And those things lace these journals, by the way, which is unsurprising when it comes to Bataille. But lovemaking even becomes it's a concept with a kind of philosophical significance for Bataille. He writes earlier in this series, from February to April, quote, "What I've done is simply to associate lovemaking and its outrageous pleasures with integral disrespect, with the radical rejection of whatever constrains inner freedom," end quote. And that's a continuous focus for Bataille. Whatever constrains inner freedom, that's what he intends to make war upon. But of course, he's speaking of inner freedom, and so there's also this question of the inner experience yet again. And that there's that other side to Bataille. We've just been sort of denigrating the love of God, but there's a mystical side to these texts in which Bataille is trying to embrace something like, we could give it all sorts of words, right? The absolute. We could just say the totality of existence. And he often becomes frustrated when trying to speak about this. At one point he says, "I no longer want to speak of mysticism and inner experience. I'd rather speak of impalement," a brutal image of lacerating mortality, which he compares, interestingly enough, to Zen Buddhism. It's worth noting that on that morning, he says he awoke in a cheerfully irreligious mood. In many ways, these diaries are sort of just a record of Bataille's moods. But at other times, he speaks of that experience at the limits of absurdity, which I'm sure many of you who have read philosophy are familiar with, in which everything seems equally absurd, equally impossible to rest one's certainty in. Everything seems equally impossible, and therefore, by that same token, everything seems equally possible. Even possibilities such as God, which Bataille has wholly discounted. Bataille writes, quote, "In this nothingness in which I exist, questioning to the point of nausea, so that every answer I get seems to push the void that much further out, doubling the questioning. I can make out nothing. And God as an answer is as empty as the quote-unquote nature found in crude materialism. Nonetheless, I can't disavow the possibilities given to those who shape God into an image, because humanly the experience of him exists, and we are familiar with his stories. The time came when the audacity, or if you will, indifference, that represented me asked, "Couldn't you too have a demented experience like that, and then laugh at it?" And I answered, "That can't be. I don't have faith." In the silence, in which I found myself crazily open to every possibility, I remained perched on the void, and everything seemed equally ridiculous, hideous, and possible to me. At that instant I passed beyond. Then and there I recognized God. Being provoked by infinite laughter didn't make this any more comfortable. I threw myself at the feet of that old ghost. Ordinarily, we have but a paltry notion of such majesty. A disclosure of it was made to me in full measure. The shadows became an infinite black beard issuing from earth's depths and gory blood. I laughed. It was infinitely more ponderous, but my lightness proceeded to deal with it effortlessly, giving back to nothingness what is simply nothingness. Outside freedom, outside laughter itself, there's nothing I laugh at more divinely than God. End quote. So he describes a kind of religious experience provoked by infinite laughter, provoked by the absurdity of questioning, and every question just pushes you out further into the void. Every question raises more questions. You never hit bedrock. And he encounters God. He throws himself at God's feet, or at least he encounters the image, the idea of God. He has the experience that the possibility given to those who shape God into an image, as he says. And yet he laughs at it. He lightheartedly and effortlessly gives back to nothingness what is simply nothingness. I wouldn't dare try to analyze this passage too closely because I think there is a reason why Bataille is speaking in image and parable. He's trying to say what can't be said, often throughout his whole canon, really. But the best summary of this passage is provided by Bataille himself in another remark he makes later in the work, quote, "To destroy transcendence, there has to be laughter," end quote. Throughout the text, there are these concepts of transcendence and immanence. Immanence is the unmediated experience of reality, perhaps something akin to what, the way Nietzsche talks about how an animal might experience reality. Total immersion in the senses, which is in no way interpreted, moralized, or instrumentalized. And it's uninterrupted. Transcendence, on the other hand, is found, Bataille says, in the nothingness of being, the objectified, conceptualized world that interrupts sensation. Quote, "When an object appears in the beyond of nothingness, in a certain sense, as a given fact of nothingness, that object transcends us." End quote. So transcendence, by this definition, is objectification, the establishment of mediating boundaries inserted into experience, and that's why it's a kind of nothingness. And we might even say that Bataille is not using the term transcendence all that differently from those philosophers of the Enlightenment who saw man's consciousness as the thing that elevates him above, again, unmediated impulse. And it's within this transcendent mode of viewing the world, however, that we become fragmented. We become identified with certain actions or activities. But there is a spiritual element or quality to his use of the term transcendence as well. It's not merely philosophical. He speaks of God's fall into transcendence, which is a rather subversive formulation. Perhaps it would be too simplistic to take any of this as a general interpretation of how Bataille uses these terms throughout his work, but he seems to describe the summit in terms of eminence when he's describing moments of bliss or ecstasy, such as yogic states, lacerating raptures. Quote, "In these incomprehensibly transparent states, the mind remains inert and intensely lucid, free. The universe easily passes through the mind." End quote. On the other hand, is not the summit experience a kind of transcendence in the sense, when we're using the language of the summit and decline, that's a spatial metaphor, right? Going up and going down. Transcending has this this notion of going up or going beyond. So in a way is not the summit also transcending the ordinary world, the world of fragmentation as we normally experience it. So there's all these ambiguities here. And if this is a bit hard to comprehend, don't worry, Bataille doesn't fully understand it either. He writes as a preamble to the section where he attempts to explain these terms, quote, "My method has confusion as a consequence, and in the long run this confusion is unbearable, particularly for me," end quote. And as a matter of fact, I find this passage from later in Bataille's diaries to be more elucidating as to what he means by these terms, rather than the notes contained in the appendix. Quote, "A state of immanence implies such a wholehearted risk of self that only independently occurring willpower can command the individual who gets to such an extreme distance. Once the lie of transcendence is revealed, responsibility is forever dissipated. In the absence of responsibility, however, the deep infinity inherent in risk escapes as well. Risk is a quest from occurrence to occurrence in the infinity of possibles. In any event, the state of immanence signifies beyond good and evil, and is related to non-ascesis and to the freedom of the senses. This applies also to the innocence of risk. Upon reaching immanence, our life has finally left the stage of the masters behind." End quote. So obviously Nietzsche is not invoked by name here, but his ideas are. Beyond good and evil is directly associated with the state of immanence and non-ascesis. So not asceticism, whatever is outside of the ascetic ideal, which is related to the freedom of the senses. So freedom from constraint, inner constraint, inner constraint is precisely what asceticism represents. When we get to the series from April to June of 1944, Bataille's depression has worsened. Quote, "Under my present living conditions, the slightest lapse of awareness brings on giddiness. At 5 a.m., I'm cold, my heart sinks. What is there to do but sleep?" End quote. He is oppressed by the constant threat of death, a fear that can't exactly be placed anywhere, and so disperses into everything. It's just a general dread at the horrific possibilities that could unfold. He spends some time in Paris, but he also wanders the French countryside, staying in a series of small towns. Some days he spends in solitude, some days with friends. Some days in the country, some in the city. Some days he's consumed with uncertainty about his lover Kay. Some days he is just enraptured by the majesty of spending moments with her. And some of my favorite entries are these slices of life, we might say, written during this unusual time to be alive. Quote, "Got there on time, after 3 miles through the forest at night. Woke up Kay chucking fistfuls of little pebbles against her window. Exhausted. Paris, dull and sluggish after the bombings. Occasional relief, though. Turning to go, S. repeated something funny that the building manager told him. Quote, "It's a sorry sight, seeing still living corpses pulled out after the air raids. A capital defense." From an account of torture in the newspaper, Petit Parisien, 427, eyes gouged out, ears, fingernails ripped off, head bashed in from numerous blows with a log, tongue sliced in two with tongs. As a child, the notion of torture made life miserable for me. Even now I can't say how I'll be able to stand it. The earth revolving in its skies. Today, everywhere. The earth a carpet of flowers, lilacs, wisteria, iris. But the war drones on, hundreds of planes filling the night, sounding like flies." End quote. So wonderful about Bataille. He's so honest about these tensions and contradictions within himself. How does this, the fact that he can't stand that this is a world in which people are tortured, how does this square with the innocence of becoming? How does it square with the earth being a carpet of flowers when there's bombing going on and torture going on? And, even just in this passage, we see the fragmentary nature of it, right? It begins with visiting my lover, and then recounting the aftermath of a bombing raid, then recounting reading about torture, and then sort of struggling with all of these feelings. And meanwhile, life goes on. After, as he says, provoking Kay during a fight, now Bataille is back at her window throwing pebbles to wake her. Bataille has to, in fact, constantly remind himself in these sentences, almost as a mantra, I will stick it out. I will go on living. He says after describing their fight, he's on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but he says, I will go on. I must go on. He repeats this many times at different points. A following passage once again juxtaposes the realities of war against the inherent beauty of existence. Bataille writes of a morning when he goes walking through the forest by himself. Quote, immense stretches of forest, wild-looking heights. I lack imagination. Carnage, conflagration, horror, that's what's in store, apparently, in the weeks to come. When I'm walking through the woods over the hills, I can't imagine it all going up in flames, although it'd catch like straw. Yesterday, from quite far off, the smoke from some sort of fire in the direction of A. Meanwhile, I'm numbering these most recent days as among the best in my life. So many flowers everywhere, the light unbelievably lovely, and far up in the sunlight a profusion of oak leaves. End quote. And as you probably noticed, he's abbreviating many names. S-A-K, he abbreviates the names of people, places. So there's this indeterminate nature to everyone he's talking about. They perhaps to conceal their identities, but, in the same way that he blurs together many months and doesn't tell you exactly when things happen, there's all of this sort of, he makes the text more uncertain in many ways. And we have a similar kind of disorienting experience conveyed here for example, earlier, the image of Sartre and Bataille dancing, putting on plays, a Picasso play under a fascist occupation. These horrific days of war are among the best in Bataille's life. Just look at all the beautiful flowers. So there's this disjunct between the serenity that's characterizing his immanent experience and what he knows consciously to be the case. That all of this beauty found in divine Mother Nature could easily be burned away, could be blasted out of existence. And it's not as though Bataille is idly imagining these possibilities. That is all perfectly within the very real and imminent possibilities disclosed by chance. These accounts of Bataille's experiences are almost always mixed up with philosophical meditations. Bataille writes in a later entry, quote, beautiful sunny day, the summer almost here, enough sun, heat, and flowers, bodies open up. Nietzsche's weakness. He criticizes from the standpoint of a moving value whose origin and end he obviously doesn't grasp. To grasp an isolated possibility that has a private end, one that's an end to itself, isn't this essentially to risk or to gamble? So maybe the interesting aspect of this has to do with the aspect of risk rather than the end chosen. What if, strictly speaking, this procedure lacked an end? Risk would mark out values just the same. The Superman, or Borgia side of things, is limited and vainly defined in relation to possibilities whose essence is a going beyond self. This in no way detracts anything from the pell-mell rush, the roaring wind that upsets all old certainties. End quote. That's, I think, one of the most important lines in the middle there for understanding Bataille's take on Nietzsche. He's positing this end, the Borgia or Superman side of things, which Bataille criticizes. But what he says is the aspect of risk rather than the end chosen is what's really interesting about Nietzsche. And Bataille begins to speak quite a bit in this series from April to June of Nietzsche's weaknesses and his failures, his impotence. Now, what's interesting is that Nietzsche himself says, as Bataille quotes from him, failure should be honored because it is failure. Nietzsche's approach to life is fundamentally experimental, and part of the experiment is the risk of failure. Being willing to go under, to perish in pursuit of one's lofty goals, is perhaps a hallmark of the Nietzschean attitude. Bataille himself also ruminates about how he feels that he is destined for failure throughout these entries. And as Nietzsche is, according to Bataille, his main companion during this time, there's a kind of self-identification that's being made with Nietzsche here, rather than a repudiation in talking about Nietzsche's failures, which is very interesting. But it's worth trying to grapple with the substance of this criticism to the extent that we can. The Superman, or the bourgeois side of things, as Bataille puts it, that can be construed as Nietzsche's end, so to speak, but goals and ends are what fragment us. And the approach to life, the mode of being that is represented or instantiated by Cesare Borgia, is only one potential side of human experience. It's just as limited and vainly defined when understood in relation to, quote, possibilities whose essence is a going beyond self. And so we may simply ask, again, to reference that chapter from Will to Power that we talked about at the very beginning of the first episode. What is a Cesare Borgia compared with the complete human being? Perhaps we can try to understand Bataille this way. Remember how Bataille described morality, as discussed in the previous episode, or how he described Christianity. Moral ends occasionally lead us to the summit, and that is their quote-unquote value. And this is a troublesome formulation because the summit is not valuable for anything. In a way, the summit is a concept that's supposed to take us beyond value and accounting for things in this way. It's supposed to be beyond all of that, but this contradiction in terms can't be helped. In the common understanding, these moral interpretations of life have some end or goal in mind for the human race, and that is seen as their value, the action that the moralities compel. So, for example, repentance as an action compelled by the morality found within the Christian religion. Now, Nietzsche's new morality, his revaluation, imposes a new goal. And Nietzsche tries to deny this. He says the overman is not an ideal, but elsewhere he does speak of the overman as a goal, as an end for the human species. We might say, again, as Bataille mentions here, it's a moving end, right? It's something that's infinitely above or so far beyond what is human that it almost constitutes a different species. But nevertheless, that has the effect of basically giving us a new goal. And Nietzsche is quite open about this, where he says, the formula for our happiness is a yes and no, a straight line, a goal. And it's rather hard to square that tension or that contradiction with Nietzsche's repudiation of all goals, all teleologies for life. And so even in Nietzsche's case, by creating the overman, he falls into this pattern once again. But yet there is a saving grace in this maneuver because Nietzsche's philosophy encourages risk and entices us to risk. In a way, it sort of suggests that that is the goal. And so it opens up new possibilities for the summit in doing this. It destroys the old certainties and thus manifests new uncertainties, which bursts forth into the will to chance. And that is Nietzsche's quote-unquote value. To repeat, quote, maybe the interesting aspect of this has to do with the aspect of risk rather than the end chosen, end quote. And we can compare this to a later passage from the June-July series, quote, in the absence of goals, ambiguity won't put things right, but will end up ruining them. The will to power remains equivocal. In a sense, in it is the will to evil, amounting to the will to expenditure or risk, which Nietzsche stressed, anticipations of some human type related to eulogizing the Borgias contradict the risk principle, which demands the free occurrence of results, end quote. So this is Bataille's criticism of Nietzsche that at the same time can be read as an attempt to follow through completely with Nietzsche's will to risk or to unbuild expenditure to the extent that this is a part of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche's anticipation for some future human type can't be anything other than a failure or a misstep, because at the end of the day, it doesn't get us out of fragmentation. But failure is a wonderful thing that ought to be sanctified. It can't really be a strike against Nietzsche. What Bataille loves is the risk principle that he finds in Nietzsche's writing, and failure, frankly, is a part of that. The visions of the countryside erupting in flames that Bataille struggles to bring into his imagination are perhaps illustrative of the prophecies of the future that had come to be seen as a certainty in the eyes of many. This new world, this new age that was experiencing its birth pangs during the world wars, within this world there's a curious companion who travels side by side with the spirit of progressive optimism, we might say, which might be a kind of spirit of suspicion, that this will eventually all end in disaster. And we can say from the very beginnings of the modern age, or the age of enlightenment, before we even started to use the term enlightenment to refer to an age, not just to refer to a process of coming into one's own maturity or something like this. Before we even had a conception of this, there were already people criticizing the underlying logic of the Enlightenment. There has always been a counter-Enlightenment current. There's always been romantic reactions against optimism and progressivism and so on. But in this context, just as many in France thought it was not only a certainty that the Nazis would lose, but that it would come at a cost of vast destruction, there was a worrying sense that, given the increasing devastation of warfare, it seemed like these eruptions of mass violence would simply continue, getting worse and worse each time. I mean, we look back and we're like, well, there was World War I and World War II. And you have the interwar years in the middle, and then there's this long peace, the post-war years that follows. And, of course, there's the Cold War. But, at least in Europe, Western Europe, there's not these outbreaks of wars. But the people at this time had no way of knowing that there was going to be this long peace. It might well have been that after World War II, you have another series of interwar years, and then World War III, and World War IV, and World War V. I mean, why not? And even given our knowledge of how history did play out, what follows the world wars is this long peace, but there's also the Cold War, where this fear of nuclear annihilation becomes ever present. And so it still fits within the same pattern where you have this constantly ramping up threat of human destructiveness, building bigger and bigger bombs, and with the idea that eventually this is going to ruin civilization itself, return us to barbarism. And so one could easily come to this idea, and many philosophers did after the dropping of the atomic bombs, that man was sort of sleepwalking insensibly to his own destruction as a kind of predetermined outcome of technological advancement. That, people such as Rousseau and Jonathan Swift, they were right. Reason does not advance us morally. Reason just gives us more power, but we're going to use reason to do the same immoral things we've always wanted to do, the same violent things that we've always done. And, today we have a version of this with AI and AI accelerationism, where they've taken this view that it is inevitable that man will be supplanted by intelligent machines, and therefore all we can do is embrace this outcome. It's already a certainty. And there's some people who take this as a very pessimistic thing, and other people who take it as a potentially optimistic thing, or strange mixtures of both, which we won't really get into here. But the point is, we hear this all the time now, right? It's a certainty. It's inevitable. And so there is a downside to embracing the will to chance and living without the hedging your bets with a belief in God or the afterlife or something like this. But there's also something positive about it. Because in spite of the fact that this sense of uncertainty can be quite stressful, I think we should remember also that oftentimes the certainties that enter the zeitgeist, the so-called certainties, the things that people say are inevitable, are so often pessimistic or in some way constrain human destiny. It's very rare that you hear somebody say, well, it's inevitable that we're going to have a Star Trek-like post-scarcity future where where people are judged solely based on merit and we go out and explore the stars. There might be people who hope for that. Does anyone say that's inevitable? I mean, the real inevitabilities that you hear about history come from religious people who think the apocalypse is just such an inevitable certainty. So in any case, I mean, and again, as I've talked about in the past, to a Christian, that can be a rather positive thing, but it's also, you're talking about the end of the world and we'll all be happy in the hereafter. And, anyway, we can leave all that aside. Most of the time when people are analyzing the trends and things like technology and economics and politics and trying to see where's the human race headed, very rarely do we have people expressing optimistic certainties. Usually when there are certainties expressed, they're pessimistic. And pessimistic certainties are constraining. And Bataille is against all such constraints. The affirmation of chance is not just an embrace of the day-to-day uncertainty of existence during the war, but also the desire to leave open possibilities for humanity on the grand scale in the future. Now, it's not as if living in a state of uncertainty about the future is inherently better or inherently comforting, we might say, because you have to acknowledge if you leave all possibilities open, things may turn out better or they may turn out much, much worse. But there's at least a possibility for a future that we haven't even dreamed of yet. And thankfully, humans are pretty bad at predicting things, especially developments in politics and culture and technology. And so usually the future is something that we've never dreamed of. The future, in fact, is uncertain. And that, in a way, is a very enlivening thought. For Bataille, however, in 1944, life simply goes on. He writes, quote, "Yesterday evening drank 2 bottles of wine together with Kay. The night, a wonderland in moonlight and storm. Forest night pools of moonlight along a road through the trees. On the embankment, little phosphorescent patches. Striking a match, portions of worm-eaten branches inhabited by glowworms. Never knew a happiness so pure, so wild and dark. Awareness of going quite far and coming to impossibility, the fascinating impossible, as if in the night we'd gotten lost. Coming back alone, climbing on the rocks, the idea that there's no necessity in the world of objects, that ecstasy might be adequate to the world and not God or objects to a mathematical necessity, appeared to me for the first time, lifting me off the ground. Atop the rocks in fierce wind, taking off the clothes I had on, because of the heat, just a shirt and pants, the wind tearing at the clouds, and by moonlight pushing and pulling them into first one shape, then another. The immense forest under moonlight, turning, looking out to, in hopes of, lost interest in being naked, put on my clothes once more. Existences, a lover or myself, slowly losing themselves into death, like clouds, unraveling in the wind. Never again. I loved Kay's face. Like clouds, unraveling in the wind. Soundlessly I entered ecstasy, reduced to a dead point, resulting in all the more clarity." End quote. It's one of my favorite scenes in the book, one of the most beautiful scenes in the book. Once again, we have the backdrop of the horror of history playing out all around you, and then you find these individual moments of serenity. But here it almost breaks forth into a kind of Zen experience, losing yourself, unraveling like clouds in the wind. And Bataille describes it as a kind of ecstasy. And he says that for the first time, the idea that there's no necessity in the world of objects appeared to him for the first time. That's, again, it shows the ways in which we've been describing how the will to chance is very similar to amor fati, but it's also somewhat different. Well, there's nuances to this, right? Because there's a great note from Nietzsche where he says, on one level, there is total causalism, so everything's determined, but on another level, nothing is caused at all. There are no causes and no effects. And so, on the one hand, fate, Nietzsche often speaks of fate as though it's entirely, everything that's happened is absolutely necessary, absolutely determined in some sense. But on another level of analysis, there are no causes and effects at all. The world is actually far more chaotic than we can even conceive of. And so in the aftermath of this evening spent with his lover, where Bataille is getting drunk and wandering the woods at night, he has this mystical experience. And so again, we have a mix of the sacred and profane, or a sort of counterposing of them, right? Because it's his romantic love for Kay, but also this sort of sacredness of this experience. And there's so many things counterposed, right? Beauty and horror, the limits of both good and evil. Finally, some good news arrives. Quote, "Learned about the landing. The news didn't penetrate. It slowly sank in. Went back to my room. A hymn to life." End quote. It seems that the Allies are on their way. The landing at Normandy was on June 6th, and Bataille does not yet know it, but it will take the Allies only a few short months to reach Paris and liberate France from the Germans. Bataille seems hopeful, but he's fallen deeper and deeper into a depressed state. Quote, "Anguish and anxiety preoccupy me and gnaw at me." End quote. Much of the anguish that Bataille writes of in the journals around this time has to be understood as owing to his own inner character, I think, rather than the external circumstances. There are certain limits of interpreting the work as a means of coping with the realities of war, I would say. Bataille's inner life is a kind of emotional roller coaster, war or no war, and there are many sections of these diaries, especially his poems, which we have not discussed in these episodes, which almost remind of Chiron, expressions of the long, dark night of the soul that Bataille suffers through and at the same time loves, says that he loves. He loves the feeling of being lacerated, even as he suffers from it. He uses the word laceration so frequently in this text, it almost becomes sort of like saturated, right? But often to refer to the violence of his own inner states. It's less often used in a literal way. It's almost always used in a metaphorical way, in an emotional sense. And the arrival of the Allies does not make ordinary life any less stressful. The violence is actually heightened in the final months of the German occupation. Quote, sounds from distant bombs, these becoming commonplace. No option for me but to spend 12 uninterrupted days, alone and without friends, staying in my room, depressed and vulnerable to gnawing anguish. What about connecting with someone, finding my life again? My shame about anguish related to the idea of chance, end quote. And so remember earlier where he's speaking about anguish. Gambling is a way of overcoming anguish, the gambling approach to life, the risk principle, that there's a deeper anguish in not being able to risk everything, and that overcomes the potential anguish of loss and just this pure affirmation of chance. But he can't help but be honest and say, I'm having guilt, or I'm ashamed, I'm having anguish about the idea of chance, which is my liberatory principle throughout the work. It's also my demon in a way. We might think of Bataille's struggle in terms of Zarathustra's struggle with nausea that he experiences at the thought of the eternal return. The thought of everything small, petty, and sick about humanity also recurring. It's ever recurring. It's now enshrined as an eternal fact. So eternal return is his most emancipatory thought, but also his most abysmal thought. And so there's a war within Bataille that we witness in these pages. And it's admirable to me that he's trying to defend himself against sort of Sartre's charges earlier in the text about his bitterness or melancholy or something like this, the hint of anguish in his voice. And here he's willing to admit, it's like, I'm trying to live in accord with this affirmation of chance, but even sometimes it does cause me anguish. And I'm ashamed of this. It's just the fact that he's willing to lay this bare is quite amazing. And that sometimes, he is cheerful, he is blasphemous, he's enjoying himself and laughing divinely, losing himself in ecstasy with K, but at other times he is shot through with depression and worry and confusion, even at his own doctrines. That he admits he even experiences confusion at his own writing. He experiences frustration at the limits of communication that he's always running up against. And Bataille continues to encourage himself, telling himself that his perseverance has proven in the past to be stronger than his anguish, and so it can overcome his anguish. In addition to the term laceration, the sheer number of times that Bataille writes the word chance also seems to make it almost lose its meaning. It becomes something akin to God or the absolute. One embraces chance by totally letting go, by loving chance, by trusting in chance. And yet Bataille argues giving into the will to chance is nothing like the love of God. God can't be chance. God is everything. So God is a kind of predetermined totality. Whereas there's no chance within God, right? God contains a logical orderliness that emanates from his being into all existence. A world governed by chance would be something more like chaos. We don't really have a good word for it, but in God there is as Christians will like to argue, there's something, sort of like nature to God, which is coherent and contiguous and emanates from his character, such that something that is inconsistent with the will or nature of God can't be something that God would do. So, the classic examples of this are, could God do something? Does God have the power to do something which is illogical? And the answer would be no, not because God doesn't have the power to do that, but because that would be out of step with God's nature as the being from whom logic issues. And so in a very important sense, chance, the way that Bataille is talking about it, can't really be compared to God. And yet he nevertheless makes it kind of an object of worship, or it's the all-important principle of this work. And so it's very interesting when Bataille describes K as almost a living embodiment of chance. We learn very little about her personality within these writings, or rather, we just get hints here and there, right? And furthermore, we only know her through Bataille's perspective in these diaries. And as he says, the beloved is only the beloved for me, that there's an image, there's a perception, there's an interpretation that you form of this person. You're seeing them through your eyes. And so I tend to think that many of the descriptions of Kay that we get in this work are telling us more about Bataille than about her, right? We might imagine if she's this embodiment of chance, does she have this mercurial personality? He says that she's nonchalant, she's innocent, even when she's driving him mad. And it seems like she alternates between hot and cold and passionate and distant. His anecdotes suggest that she's spontaneous or unpredictable. But again, is this just something that we're seeing through Bataille's eyes? He writes, quote, "Why complain about Kay? Chance is endlessly contested, endlessly gambled. If Kay had decided to embody chance right down to the last molecule in her, she couldn't have done better. Appearing, although when anguish, then disappearing so suddenly that anguish, as if night alone could precede her, as if only night would follow her, but each time without intending it, appropriately, if she is chance. Instead of God, chance. This means nature insofar as it occurs, though not as occurring once and for all, but as surpassing itself in infinite occurrences, excluding any possible limits. In this infinite representation, a representation that quite likely is the boldest and most arranged ever tried out by humankind, the idea of God explodes like a bombshell. Divine impoverishment and impotence dashing with human chance." End quote. Spinoza said God or nature. Bataille says chance or nature. He admits that this description of things is deranged, but I love his imagery here of the explosion of God. God is a truth that stands once and for all, and thus within God all limits are eternally established, and the laws that this eternal mind creates. This view of chance as the highest expression of nature instead surpasses all limits, right? No limits, no constraints. God is a world ruled by God. If God is the supreme principle of existence, of nature, is a world which is totally constrained. And that's not a world that Bataille sees. It's not one that he's interested in. But if God is to explode like a bombshell and chance is to erupt from this, so if chance is to take the place of God, it's interesting that he's chosen as a romantic partner someone who embodies that same principle. So once again, the beloved could be contrasted with God as a recipient of one's desires. With the beloved, one risks everything. To love God is to risk nothing. But Bataille has made chance into his God, not in the traditional sense, but it's like his image of nature. In some sense, it's an image that surpasses all images, the limits of all images. But nevertheless, we see what he's doing here. And in his personal life, we could say perhaps oversimplifying that he has chosen to worship chance in the form of a woman. So again, there's this unity of the sacred and the profane. And yet, even this portrait of Kay that we've attempted to conjure out of these diaries can't be complete without those moments in which there are ruptures in this portrayal of her personality. Quote, "This morning, depressed following a night of ungrounded fears, insomnia, sounds of massed planes filling her with dread, Kay started softly shaking. Frail, despite her appearance of being spirited, playful and full of zip. Generally, anxiety prevents me from noticing an unfounded distress like this, empathizing with my woes and hardships, ruts that turn into a way forward for me. She laughed with me good-naturedly. Surprised suddenly to think of her, against the odds, as friend, sister even. But had things been otherwise, we would be strangers." End quote. June, July 1944. The Americans are finally here. The prospect of the occupation coming to an end finally begins to seem real. Bataille witnesses a convoy of American planes, quote, "striped black and white. They whooshed rooftops, machine-gunned roads, and a railroad," end quote. Over the course of this series, the skirmishes between the Americans and Germans become all the more frequent. The advance of the Allies seems unstoppable. Bataille, too, is determined to advance with his philosophical work. The idea of nature as a kind of limitless chaos of infinite possibilities, ventured in an earlier entry, still demands further elucidation. Bataille writes, quote, "In a rather random way, written as chance and risk dictate, to say this, that time is the same as being, and being is the same as chance and time. This signifies that, if there is time being, time encloses being in the occurrence of chance individually. The possibilities are apportioned out and oppose each other. Without individuals, that is to say, without apportioning the possibles, time wouldn't exist. Time is the same as desire. The object of desire is for time not to exist. Time is the desire for time not to exist. The object of desire is to cancel individuals, others. For each individual and each subject of desire, this means reduction of the others to oneself, to be everything. To want to be everything, or God, is to want to cancel time, is to want to cancel chance, randomness. Not to want this is to want time and chance. To want chance is amor fati, love of fate. Amor fati signifies wanting chance, signifies differing from what was. To attain the unknown and risk it, to gamble it." End quote. This is a bit of a mind-bending passage, but it's one of my favorite philosophical inquiries in the text. And I think the best way to approach it is to sort of examine some of the individual pieces of the passage that are a little bit easier or more intuitive, and then move from those to an understanding of the whole idea of chance as it is presented here. Desire is presented in a tyrannical sense. It can be understood in that tyrannical way. When taken to the extreme, all impulses wish to tyrannize over the whole system, over the whole organism, as Nietzsche would have put it. So many of our fantasies and wish fulfillment, sort of the image of the goal that the desire presents to us, involve this idea of having a godlike power to fulfill our desires. But what if I could just do this, right? What if the resistance of others could just be overcome? What if any resistance became irrelevant to what I wanted? That's sort of the dream, the fantasy. We might think of the Buddhist notion of desire, tanha, meaning selfish craving. Perhaps the most accurate translation, usually that's just translated as desire. But the desire wishes to subordinate everything to itself. And if you take this to the extreme, that is akin to wanting to be God, which means to want to be everything, in the sense that everything collapses into myself, or my desire that has come to be identified with the self. There is no resistance to this desire tyrannizing over myself, and everything becomes a part of it because there's no resistance to that desire taking whatever it wants. So all being taken into myself. But what is being? Well, here Bataille says being is time. And I really wonder if he had access to Nietzsche's time atom fragment. I'm uncertain if he did, because it's interesting to compare what he says here to Nietzsche's time atomism. In that fragment, Nietzsche asks us to imagine not atoms of matter, but atoms of time. It's a kind of materialism, but where the material is time rather than space. There's no substance at all. There's just different time points, which nevertheless flow into one another as a continuum. And so here Bataille says, being is just time. Our individual being is an apportionment of a temporal possibility. So there are all these possibilities for time being, but they all oppose one another. I think, again, it's helpful to think of the concept of fragmentation from earlier. There are infinite potential uses or courses of development for anything, but when one potential becomes actualized, all the others are negated. So all the possibilities can't come true at once. The individual as the apportionment of the possible is the reason for time's existence, because without possibility, you might have something like the solid, static, dead sphere of being spoken of by Parmenides. And it's interesting to contrast this theory of time being with the Parmenidean theory of being, because Parmenides, of course, denies the passage of time or the reality of motion. It is all an illusion. The truth is this undivided totality of being. It is not even that all apparent possibilities would actually be inevitabilities or eternal facts in the way that one might describe all existence from the standpoint of the flat circle, right? Or to put it in other terms, from the perspective of scientific determinism, everything's just in one superposition. Everything it does is already written. But rather, those possibilities themselves aren't even real to Parmenides because being cannot change or develop within the Parmenidean pure theory of being. And that means our sensation of these changes and developments must be mistakes or errors of our senses. And so we have this view of individuals as a possibility for time being, which is substantially the same as desire. And yet this desire in the most fundamental sense, like all desire, wants to be God, to subordinate everything to itself. But from the perspective of God, the passage of time would be just as illusory as it is for Parmenides. And so time only exists for these desiring portions of possibility, but what they each desire is for time not to exist, i.e. for the eternality of their being, for the totality of their being, to encompass everything. Following from this, Bataille then attempts to articulate this incredibly strange counter-possibility for life, amor fati, loving chance, which means to affirm the opposite, to desire to affirm time and being. He has intentionally led us into a thicket of contradictions because the way he has defined desire in this particular passage would make this the very antithesis of desire, wouldn't it? That's why the will to chance is so hard to describe, because it would be the desire for time not to exist. But maybe by bringing out more contradictions within our language, in a paradoxical way, maybe Bataille can adumbrate what is so extraordinary about the will to chance. As we've said, it's not just like being okay with taking risks in pursuit of a goal, but risk itself as the goal, as the principle of existence. Desire that realizes that desire aims at a kind of totality that it can never achieve, and thus wills desire in itself, but not for the sake of the goals. So it's a kind of desire that wills desiring, not so much the fulfillment of desire. This is probably the most rigorous attempt at a kind of metaphysics of chance provided by the work. And I'm not sure if it necessarily accomplishes anything other than just, again, maybe break open some new possibilities. Meanwhile, in the physical world, uncertainty continues to play with Bataille's inner states. It seems that he and Kay are relatively happy again, but Bataille can always find some new arena for his inner war. He begins interrogating his own feelings and their origins. Quote, "Still alone, the idea I might be loving Kay out of self-hatred scares me. Burning passions prying apart lips, leaving my mouth dry, inflaming my cheeks. These emotions probably relate to some kind of self-revulsion. I don't like myself, don't like Kay. This evening, kindled by inhuman difficulties, our shared passion reached fever pitch. No matter what the cost, I must escape myself. I must identify with what for me would be an unlimited image, though an anguish related to feelings of ambiguity paralyzes Kay." End quote. And I think it's fair to wonder at this point, is Kay really the one who is mercurial? Is she the one who embodies chance, or is it Bataille himself who is its embodiment? The beloved only, exists in the mind of the lover as an image. He's made her into an embodiment of chance, as what the psychoanalysts would call a projection, most likely. And here, Bataille is the one with the feelings of ambiguity. He is the fickle, undecided, chaotic one in the relationship, and he knows that these feelings cause her anguish. Toward the end of July, Bataille's mood seems to be improving. And just as Nietzsche often expressed gratitude towards his own sickness, for the strength he felt was gained through convalescence, Bataille is thankful for his own anguish and anxiety. Now, the dissipation of these feelings breaks forth into a glorious sense of triumph. Quote, "In the sunlight this morning, a magical feeling of happiness, the thickness in me now gone, even jubilation no longer an issue for me. An infinitely simple life, blending with the stones, the moss, the sun-filled air. What I used to think was that the times of anguish, of mishap, prepared the way for the opposite moments. The end of anguish, luminous relief. That's true. Though in the feelings I have this morning, knowing and loving whatever's alive, on the streets, men, children, women, chance and happiness are situated much closer than the most recent leap." End quote. August of 1944. The occupation of France is almost at an end. It is here that Bataille attempts to draw some philosophical conclusions from the war itself, which perhaps surprisingly he has not really done up until this point. His struggles, again, have mostly been inner struggles, to the extent that his inner experience is related to the external circumstances of the war. His philosophical wrestling always repeatedly returns to the inner experience rather than pitching itself outward. But here, however, he attempts to articulate some sort of understanding about humanity at large, draw a political conclusion from the experience of the war and all of these philosophical ruminations that were birthed by it. Quote, "This afternoon, 4 American planes attacking a train loaded with oil and gasoline, the train in a station a mile or so from here, hitting it with bombs, artillery, machine guns. The planes, now low, buzzed roofs, darting through black columns of smoke like awkward, scary insects, dive-bombing the train, then up again to the sky. Every few minutes there would be another one up above us, plunging through thundering machine gun fire, the motors, the bombs, the rapid-action artillery guns. For a quarter of an hour, and without any personal risk, I watched this pageant. It fascinated the viewers. We trembled and marveled, and after the fad we thought of the victims. Some 30 train cars burned, and billowing up for hours, as if from a crater, huge smoke clouds darkened parts of the sky. At an aquatic festival 200 yards from the train, large numbers of children had gathered. No one dead, no one injured. No further radio reports on the advances of the armored columns. In any case, I'm assuming that they're less than 20 miles from here. A couple of pickup trucks with German troops inside stopped in front of me, looking for a bridge over the Seine, irregularly fleeing east. For the first time, regarded from a more or less dispassionate viewpoint, however, I have grasped the meaning of the war, that it is a transcendence against immanence. The defeat of National Socialism connects with the isolation of transcendence and the Hitlerite illusion as the latter, and a movement of transcendence is unleashed in force. Slowly the force mobilizes a greater force against it, the result of reactions realized within immanence." End quote. And before I comment, there's another passage from a bit later that's worth considering in conjunction. Quote, "The Germans in any case exude transcendent mediocrity. The immanence of the Americans is undeniable. Their existence is in themselves and not beyond." End quote. So immanence, unmediated experience, expenditure free of instrumentalization or moral interpretation, completely in the moment. The Americans are simply there to carry out their orders. Simple, uncomplicated, unpretentious. Maybe they can be a little bit arrogant, but they don't even have that British sense of pompousness. And this isn't even that surprising, given the description of the general American mentality or way of being. Oftentimes Europeans have stereotyped Americans this way as being simpler people, sometimes as an insult, but, Americans, we are more down to earth. Bataille also speaks a bit earlier of the masses. He says the pretense of transcending the masses these days is like spitting into the wind. It just falls back onto you. We are ultimately, all of us, possibilities for the will's convulsions, fragments of the whole human being whose existence we may perhaps experience only at the summit. Bataille quotes from The Gay Science the passage in which Nietzsche is sitting and watching the waves hit the shore at Genoa. Nietzsche says to the waves, "You and I are of one kind. We are of the same race." He compares the waves to the will, greedily seeking its object, seemingly rising up out of the undifferentiated waters and attaining something that appears like a distinct existence, at least for a moment in time, surging, seeking the coast, as if it is after something, but then it crests and dissolves back into the ocean. For all of his differences with the workers, which Bataille admits, is he not simply another sine wave on the ocean of humanity? And lest one thinks that he's diverging terribly from Nietzsche here. Nietzsche himself asked toward the end of The Gay Science, who is not common today? And this is not to say that Nietzsche isn't looking for something that's beyond what is common, that is noble, that is above the common. But there's just so much, again, we have to admire the honesty of Bataille, because there's so much play acting and just farcical claims of, aristocracy today in a world in which everything has become manifestly common. Very often people who express a kind of claim to nobility have, in fact, no right to claim it. And so, is there anyone who does transcend the masses? What has transcendence become? It's become a form of hypocrisy, a disjunct, again, between words and actions. We're all part of the same mass of possibilities. Each life is like a wave that only seems to rise above it. Bataille says that he wants instead to exist on a human level. The Americans seem to exist on a human level. The Germans, on the other hand, are transcendent hypocrites. Mediocre because their transcendence, like all movements that characterize decline, their transcendence fixes its subject at a determinate point in a determinate form. It celebrates their fragmentation. Their transcendence, in fact, can only ever be something particular because it is bounded to their particular conception of the race, the preservation of a certain genetic type. They are fixed to a goal. They're fixed to a course of action, denying all future change or uncertainty. Life goes on. Quote, "Saw K. We heard the roar of the artillery and the sound of machine guns." End quote. Fittingly, this is the last interaction with K. The diary concludes without any indication of what ultimately happens with K. Now, we do know, just from Bataille's biography, that they eventually do get married, but we don't receive any certainty in the diary about their relationship, that they're going to tie the knot or that they're going to break things off. And certainly Bataille wouldn't have had any certainty about the future. And so it's a lot like real life, isn't it? And the story of a relationship isn't over, really, until one or both parties are dead. We're so used to happily ever afters in popular fiction, but that doesn't really happen in real life. And so there's no conclusion. How could there be? Even if he gave us a conclusion, it wouldn't actually be the conclusion. Instead, quote, "Uncertainty on the subject of K remains sheer agony. In this remote, sealed-off area, it undermines and destroys me. The relatively slow military operations stir up people's legitimate fears." End quote. It has now been years of waiting at this point, long, agonizing waiting. The relatively slow military operations that Bataille refers to are actually proceeding, relatively speaking, at a rapid pace. But the last mile home is always the longest, as they say. And just as a brief digression, I remember there was a psychological study where they studied airline attendants who smoked, and they reported that during the flight, when smoking is impossible, their self-reported cravings didn't just increase steadily or linearly with time, but actually remained constant, or rather, they knew it was impossible to smoke, so they weren't really having cravings. But these cravings spiked when they knew they were about 15 minutes from landing. So when you know it's almost over, that's when the craving kicks in again. When you can wait for hours and hours and hours, but you become most impatient when it's about to be over. When you've already waited so long, you would think it would be no small matter to wait just a little while more. But when the end is near, we lose the immanence we might have had in the waiting. We begin to anticipate the end. We become certain of the outcome, and so we lose our patience. We want to hurry it along. And in this state of angst, Bataille's emotional travails over his tryst flare up all over again. But before long, the war has come in full force to Bataille himself. The German defeat is imminent. He watches from a distance, as the same patch of woodlands that he walked through, and mused that it was impossible for him to imagine it in flames, or that he lacked the imagination for it. He watches as it is now incinerated. Quote, "It's most likely that the Germans are giving up. By night, artillery rattles our doors. At the end of the day, there are some 20 incredibly violent explosions. A major munitions depot blows up. I feel the shock waves between my shoulders and legs. A few miles from here, flames lick the sky. I see an explosion from atop the boulders. At the skyline, immense, blindingly red flames leap through black smoke. The wooded skyline is the same I saw 3 months ago when I complained of lack of imagination. At the time, I couldn't imagine battle lacerations, the devastation of lovely vistas, like immense slow waves moving over oceans of trees. Today, I saw huge conflagrations. 5 or 6 miles from here, an artillery spits out its rage, its sounds eventually swallowed by enormous explosions. But on top of the boulders, the children are laughing. The calmness of the world remains integral. Finally, the news is less confused. Two cyclists arriving from Paris tell me what's happened. Street fighting, a French flag raised over City Hall, end quote. Before long, the Germans have all fled. The destruction that everyone predicted has erupted everywhere. Bataille says that every direction he looks, there is fire on the horizon. He spends the afternoon listening to machine gun onslaughts and deafening bursts of artillery. Allied planes sweep the German columns, strafing them with bullets. The French resistance troops arrive that night around 9 p.m. Everyone gathers in the town square to round up the collaborators, including the mayor and the man who led the local collaborationist forces. The masses chant. The French flags are everywhere. From the fires in the distance, there is an oppressive red hue that illuminates the scene. Everything's bathed in a bloody red. The collaborators are loaded onto trucks. As a woman that Bataille describes as seeming mean-spirited, it rather badly sings the Marseillaise, the anthem of the French Revolution. He says her rendition of the song is, quote, disgusting and ridiculous, end quote. And he's sort of uncomfortable with the parallels between what's happening here and the reign of terror. It's certainly, we can understand why it would be justified to round up all of these collaborators. And yet there's still something gross about the whole thing. There's always something that's, it's like a sort of a mirror reflection of fascism, where you're going in and rounding people up and putting them on trucks. And there are disputes as to whether or not the mayor should be put on the truck. That some people think he should, some think he shouldn't. And shoving matches break out among the crowd. And it's like a recreation of the revolution's excesses. Bataille has no love for the collaborators at all, but seeing them rounded up and shipped off in trucks, likely to be shot and thrown into some ditch, thinking about it makes him a little bit sick. At the climax of the event, artillery fires off again in the distance, and Bataille says it makes the whole grim situation that much worse. But this chaotic scene is merely the final death row of the occupation. France is, once again, free. Throughout his diaries, Bataille has struggled with many things, but above all, we have to remember the terms in which he begins on Nietzsche. He says in the preface, he's burning with longings, full of an incontrovertible desire. He longs for things that can't be put into words. He has feelings he can't explain. He tries to communicate the incommunicable. He tries to express knowledge about that which there can be no knowledge about. The obliteration of the self, the subject. Towards the end of the August Diaries, the epilogue, he asks, quote, how can we help realizing and then endlessly sensing over and over again the lie of objects that excite our desire? Yet in this senseless darkness, further than nonsense and collapse, I am still lacerated by a passion to communicate the news of a nightfall to my beloved, as if this communication alone and no other would suffice as a measure of love's greatness. Thus, endlessly here and there, the mad lightning stroke of chance is reborn, demanding in us, as a prerequisite, the realization of the lies and nonsense that it is. End quote. Every desire that grips you, in some sense, lies to you. Nietzsche speaks of this. Life is always coming up with new seductions to life, new enchantments, new tricks, and creative ambiguities that present themselves to us. We might say that this is what happens when you are intoxicated by a longing for a person. Such desires lead you into a dream world of possibilities, of hopes and fears. A Buddhist or a Schopenhauerian would remind us that no desire ever ultimately leads to satisfaction. It only ever can lead to more desire. The lie that desire tells us is the lie of ends, that attaining this end will finally bring satisfaction, but it never does. What Bataille wants instead is the desire that desires desire that justifies itself, and he's invested a great deal of metaphysical importance to things like love-making, absorbed in the beautiful idea that by violating ourselves we achieve communion, in an act that mimics the summits of mystical experience and martyrdom. He's invested all this importance into lover's luck, into the play of attractions and chance circumstances that give rise to two lovers finally achieving communion. But is all of this perhaps another lie, another intoxication brought about by romantic desire itself? Bataille has made chance into his God. He's also made chance into his lover, to communicate one's nightfall, to somehow leap over the chasm between subjectivities, and commune, to impart to her your deepest experience, your deepest lacerations. Is such a thing possible? Is that the measure of the greatness of one's love, or is that sense of greatness yet another intoxication? To transcend these desires, or to constrain them, these movements of decline will always take hold. Bataille told us earlier of the inevitability of decline. We live in a kind of senseless ignorance, a kind of darkness, but within that darkness, the mad lightning strike of chance. It becomes possible. It illumines, though it is also lethal. It is deadly. Chance continually springs back into being. Our desires ultimately demand of us that we risk everything for them. And though their ends are lies, the desire itself renews itself in these lies. Now, with Bataille's disclosures and full realization of the lie of desire, and the knowledge that whatever we are liable to believe when under its influence is nonsense, we are now able to affirm the will to chance in itself. It's a prerequisite that we know it's a lie before we can affirm desire in itself, because all other affirmations of desire are understood through the ends. They end up representing a moralization of the accursed share of our unproductive expenditures. They always fall into these moralizations. The only way to do it is to know that the ends are a lie. It's the only way to affirm chance. So we know full well that desire plays tricks on us, but we go along with the trick. Our many tragedies, ever recurring at the end of every story of a mad desire that grips us and intoxicates us, we now affirm those tragedies, and we seek after them. And that's not an anguish for us, for the only anguish would be not to bet, not to risk everything. As Nietzsche writes at the beginning of The Gay Science, which Bataille cites at the beginning of his diaries, quote, "Brief tenured tragedy finally has always returned to the eternal comedy of existence, and the sea with its countless smiles, to speak with Aeschylus, with its waves, will finally cover the greatest of our tragedies." End quote. How to conclude, then, this study of Bataille? There is a moment in the series from April to June in which Bataille seems to speak directly to us, to give us a call to action. Strange to say, given how this entire work could be seen as discarding all calls to action, and yet we don't need to concern ourselves with such cheap paradoxes. It was one of those uncanny moments as I was reading on Nietzsche. I suddenly felt as though Georges Bataille was speaking to me, personally. Perhaps he's speaking to you too here. Bataille writes, quote, "You, whoever you are, reading me, take your own chance, just as, at the moment of writing, I gamble with you. This chance isn't yours or mine. It belongs to all humanity, to human light. And has it ever before possessed such brilliance as the night now confers on it?" End quote. Folks, we have just closed the book on Season 6 of the Nietzsche podcast, and that's very good news for those of you who have been waiting impatiently for the return of our read-through of The Gay Science. We're finally opening its pages again and starting in on Book 5. That will be the interseason, and I'm very excited to finally finish that text. But for now, I just want to enjoy the summit that we've reached. We've really expanded the podcast to cover a lot of material beyond Nietzsche, still returning to Nietzsche as a touchstone throughout this season, Nietzsche and the Taoists, Nietzsche and the demonic, Nietzsche and Hume, Nietzsche's theories of language put alongside Kesserer and Wittgenstein. We're going to plumb the depths of knowledge even further next season. But for now, friends, all I have left to say is, amor fati, whoever you are listening to me, take your own chance. Fortune has given us all a great gift, that we are alive, and incredible possibilities are open to us. Those possibilities are yours to seize or to squander, and both would be perfectly acceptable responses. I only ask that you risk everything. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.